The night I drove my surgeon home in the rain was the same night I almost walked away from the only career I had ever loved. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of evening where the sky turns purple before 6 and the cold gets into your coat, no matter how many layers you wear. The retirement party for one of the hospital's longest-serving nurses, Margaret, was being held at a small Italian place called Caruso's, about 3 blocks from Mercy General. Nothing fancy. White tablecloths, candles in glass jars, a playlist of soft jazz that nobody was really listening to. The kind of gathering where people say nice things about someone they've spent years barely noticing, and then go home feeling like they've done something good. I almost didn't go. My name is Audrey, and at the time I was 27 years old and 8 months into my first real nursing job in the cardiac unit at Mercy General Hospital in Cincinnati. I had worked harder than I thought a person could work to get there. I grew up in a small town called Harlan in eastern Kentucky, where the biggest employer was a Dollar General distribution center and the closest thing to healthcare was a walk-in clinic that closed at 4 on Fridays. My mom had cleaned rooms at a Holiday Inn for 16 years. My dad drove a truck. They didn't have money to give me, but they gave me something else, a stubbornness about not settling, that I carried with me all the way through community college, then a 4-year nursing program at the University of Kentucky, then a competitive residency application process that nearly broke me 3 separate times before Mercy General finally said yes. I was proud of that job. I was proud of every single shift. But by October, I was falling apart inside, and nobody knew it. The reason was Dr. Frances Keller. Dr. Keller was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Mercy General. She had trained at Johns Hopkins, spent 8 years at Mass General, and arrived in Cincinnati with a reputation that walked into the room about 30 seconds before she did. She was in her early 50s, tall, with silver hair. She kept in a tight bun and reading glasses. She wore on a chain around her neck that she almost never actually used for reading. She moved through the hospital like someone who had never once been uncertain about anything in her entire life. She terrified most of the nursing staff. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. For the first 3 months, I told myself her behavior was just about standards. She corrected my charting in a tone that made me feel like a student who hadn't done the reading. She questioned my post-op observations in front of other nurses. Once, in the hallway outside room 412, she stopped me mid-sentence while I was briefing her on a patient's overnight vitals and said, with zero expression on her face, "Start over. You're giving me impressions. I need facts." I stood there with my clipboard about 12 years old. I told myself it was fine. I told myself this was how good doctors were. I watched the other nurses and they seemed to accept it. Or at least they had learned to move around her, the way you learn to move around a piece of furniture that's always in the same spot. But by October, I had started dreading my shifts in a way that made my stomach hurt on the drive-in. I would sit in the parking garage for an extra 5 minutes before going through the doors, just to brace myself. I had started making small mistakes, not dangerous ones, but the kind that come from anxiety, from second-guessing yourself before you even act. I forgot to reorder a supply twice in 1 week. I put the wrong date on an incident form. Each one felt like confirmation of something I was increasingly afraid was true, that I wasn't good enough to be there, and Dr. Keller had somehow known it before I did. 3 weeks before Margaret's retirement party, I had started researching other hospitals. There was an opening at a smaller facility in Lexington. The salary was lower, the unit less competitive. But I kept the listing open in a browser tab on my phone. I kept looking at it the way you look at a door you're not sure you're allowed to use. I hadn't told anyone. Not my roommate, not my mom, not my closest friend from nursing school who texted me every Sunday to check in. I just carried it by myself, which is something I had always done with the things that felt like failure. The retirement party was mandatory in that unofficially mandatory way, where nobody says you have to be there, but everyone knows if you're not. So I put on a dark green dress I hadn't worn since my cousin's rehearsal dinner, drove through the rain to Caruso's, and found a seat near the back next to a respiratory therapist named Kevin, whose last name I never caught. The speeches were warm and a little long. Margaret cried. Her husband cried. 3 of the attending physicians said variations of the same thing about dedication and legacy, and 32 years of exceptional service. I drank a glass of white wine and thought about the Lexington job listing, and wondered if I was being a coward or being smart, and whether those were even different things. I had been there maybe 45 minutes when I noticed Dr. Keller standing near the end of the bar. She had arrived late, like most of the senior physicians. She was in street clothes, a dark blazer over a gray top, which was the first time I had ever seen her in anything other than scrubs or her white coat. She looked different without them. Not smaller, exactly, but more exposed, like a version of herself that wasn't quite being assembled. She was holding a glass of water, not wine, and she wasn't talking to anyone. She was looking at her phone with an expression I couldn't immediately name. I almost looked away. I almost went back to my wine and my private spiral about Lexington. But something stopped me. I watched her for another moment, and I realized that the expression on her face wasn't the flat, controlled neutrality I was used to seeing. It was something else. Her jaw was tight in a way that looked like effort, like she was actively holding something in place. Her shoulders, which were always perfectly straight, had dropped slightly, and her hand, the one holding the water glass, had gone still in a way that didn't look relaxed. She looked like someone who had just received very bad news and was trying to decide what to do with it in a room full of people who were looking at her. I don't know what made me stand up. I genuinely don't. Every reasonable instinct I had said to stay where I was, to finish my wine, to let Dr. Frances Keller handle whatever was happening, because she always handled everything. That was the whole point of her. But I stood up anyway, and I walked over to the end of the bar, and I said the only thing I could think of, which was, "Dr. Keller, can I get you anything?" She looked up from her phone. For a second, I thought she was going to dismiss me with the same precision she used on my charting reports. But she didn't. She just looked at me, and something in her expression shifted in a way I had never seen before, a kind of involuntary relief, like she had been waiting for someone to notice without knowing she was waiting. "I'm fine," she said, and then about 3 seconds later, "Actually, I'm not." We ended up standing there at the end of the bar for a while, not talking much, just standing. The party moved around us. Someone gave another toast. The jazz playlist looped. After about 10 minutes, she said she was going to get her coat and leave, and I said I would walk her out, and I'm still not entirely sure why I said that either. Outside, it was raining harder than when I had arrived. She had come in a car service, but when she looked at her phone to request a ride, her hands weren't cooperating with the screen the way they should have been. I watched her try twice and then just stop. I said, "I can drive you." She looked at me for a moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know," I said. She got in my car. The drive to her neighborhood, a quiet street of older brick homes in Hyde Park, took about 20 minutes in the rain. We didn't talk for the first few minutes. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the tail seats of the cars in front of me blur and clear in the wet, and I didn't push anything. I had learned a long time ago that silence isn't always uncomfortable. Sometimes it's just the space where something true is getting ready to come out. She spoke first. Her voice was different in my car than it ever was in the hospital. Quieter. Lower. Like she had turned some internal volume dial all the way down. She told me that her son, who was 23 and had been living in Seattle for the past 2 years, had called her that afternoon to tell her he had been diagnosed with a heart condition. Not immediately life-threatening. Manageable with medication and monitoring, the cardiologist out there had said, but the word manageable had its own weight, didn't it, she said. Because manageable was different from gone. Manageable meant it was going to be there, in the background, forever. She told me he had called her first, before his roommate, before his girlfriend, before his dad, who Dr. Keller had been divorced from for 9 years. He had called her first, she said, and she hadn't known what to say, which was not something she was accustomed to. She had spent 30 years telling other people's families hard things. She knew all the language. She knew how to calibrate a sentence to carry both honesty and hope at the same time. But when it was her own kid on the phone, all of that just fell away, and she had stood in the break room on the 4th floor of Mercy General, in the middle of a regular Thursday afternoon, and simply not known what to say. She had said she would be there this weekend. She had booked a flight before the call was over. Then she had gone back to the party, because leaving seemed worse than staying, though she wasn't sure anymore why she had thought that. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just let what she had said exist in the car without rushing to fill the space around it. Then I said, "That sounds really hard." She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite something else. "It is," she said, and then, "Thank you for not telling me he'll be okay." "He might be," I said, "but you don't need me to say that right now." She turned and looked at me in the way that people do when you've said something unexpected, like they're recalibrating slightly. We drove for another block or two before she spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I said yes. How long have you been considering leaving Mercy General? I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. The rain tapped against the windshield. I thought about lying or deflecting, but both of those felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. A few weeks, I said. Because of me, she said. It wasn't a question. Partly, I said. She was quiet again. I made a turn onto her street and slowed down because the road was slick and the numbers on the houses were hard to read in the dark. I owe you an explanation, she said, and probably an apology. I didn't say anything. I was trained by people who believed that the way you develop someone is by making them work harder than they think they can, she said. My chief resident told me once that if you want to know what someone is made of, you apply pressure and you watch. If they crack, you know. If they don't, you know something else. She paused. I have been watching you since your 3rd week on the unit. I pulled up in front of a brick house with a lit porch lamp. I put the car in park. You don't crack, she said. You absorb, you make adjustments. You keep going. That's rare, Audrey. That's genuinely rare. Hearing her say my name felt strange. Not bad, just strange. Like hearing a word in a language you've been studying and suddenly realizing you understand it. The way I've been treating you wasn't right, she said. I know that. I justified it to myself by saying I was pushing you towards something. But that only works if the person knows why the pressure is there, and I never told you. So from the outside, it just looked like I didn't believe in you. And that's the opposite of what's true. I didn't know what to do with that. I sat with it for a minute, watching the rain on the windshield. I have to tell you something else, she said. Her voice shifted slightly, became more careful, the way it sometimes did right before she said something clinical and important. A few months ago, I received an inquiry from a colleague at the University of Cincinnati. They're building a new cardiac care program, and they're looking for exceptional candidates for a clinical education track. It's a pathway that combines advanced nursing with medical education, patient care, and, if you want it, a direct route into medical school with full departmental sponsorship. I turned and looked at her. I submitted your name, she said. 6 weeks ago. I wrote the recommendation myself. You, I said, and then I stopped, because I didn't have the rest of the sentence. I should have told you, she said. I kept waiting for what I thought was the right moment. I didn't want to tell you while I was still working with you the way I was, because I thought it would seem, I don't know, she paused. Inconsistent, I repeated. You deserve to know, she said. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I stared at the lit porch lamp through the rain-streaked glass. I thought about the Lexington job listing on my phone. I thought about my mom at the Holiday Inn, and my dad and all those early mornings driving to the community college in the dark. I thought about being 12 years old and watching an ER doctor on television and thinking, I want to do something like that. I want to be someone who can help in that particular way, and not knowing for years if someone like me was even allowed to want that. I don't know what to say, I told her. You don't have to say anything tonight, she said. She opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. Then she paused with one hand on the door and looked back at me. I'm not good at this, she said. At the human part. I know that. I've known it for a long time and I haven't done enough about it. She looked down for a second, then back at me. But I want you to stay. Not because the unit needs you, though it does. Because I think you are going to do something significant with this career, and I don't want to be the reason you decide not to. She closed the door. I sat in the dark for a long time after her porch light went on inside the house. The next morning I deleted the Lexington job listing from my phone. I didn't make a big decision out of it. I just deleted it, the way you delete something when you know you're not going to go back to it. Then I went to work, walked into the cardiac unit and did my job. Dr. Keller was in surgery until 11. When she came out, she passed me in the hallway and gave me a brief nod. That was it. But it was different from every other nod she had ever given me, and I knew it and she knew I knew it, and that was enough. Things didn't change overnight. That's not how it works, and I want to be honest about that. Dr. Keller didn't suddenly become warm or easy, or the kind of supervisor who asked how your weekend was. She was still demanding. She still expected precision. She still corrected my charting. But the correction started to come with context. A sentence of explanation instead of just the correction alone. A because at the end. And gradually over the months that followed, I started to understand that the pressure she applied wasn't about doubt. It was about preparation. I also watched her change in other ways, smaller ones that most people probably didn't notice. She started taking her lunch in the break room instead of her office more often. She remembered the names of nurses she had previously seemed to look past. Once, I heard her tell a patient's daughter, in the hallway outside the ICU, "I know this is terrifying, I'm a parent too." It was such a small thing, but I had never heard her say anything like it before. Her son, whose name was Ben, had his procedure in November. She flew out to Seattle on a Friday and was back in the hospital Monday morning. I found out later, from someone else, that she had sat with him in the recovery room for 6 hours and hadn't left the hospital until he was stable and sleeping. She never mentioned it at work, not once. That spring, I got a call from the University of Cincinnati program. They invited me for an interview. I sat in a conference room with 3 physicians and a program director and talked for 2 hours about why I wanted to be in medicine, what I thought was missing from patient care, and what I believed nurses understood about illness that doctors sometimes lost sight of. It was the best conversation I had ever had about any of this, the kind where you realize mid-sentence that you've believed something for years, but never had words for it until right now. 2 weeks later, they offered me a spot. I accepted it. Dr. Keller was in the middle of a post-surgical debrief when I found her. I knocked on the door and told her I had something to tell her when she had a minute. She looked up, read something in my face, and said to the room, "Give me 2 minutes." She stepped into the hallway, and I told her. She didn't smile. That wasn't quite her way. But something happened in her eyes that I had only seen once before, on a rainy night in my car on a quiet street in Hyde Park, and that was enough. "Good," she said. "You should accept it." "I already did," I said, and then she did something I would not have predicted. She put her hand briefly on my shoulder, just for a second, the way someone does when words aren't quite the right instrument for what they're trying to say. "Good," she said again, and went back into the room. "I am in my 2nd year of the program now. The work is harder than anything I have ever done. There are days when I wonder if I was wrong to leave the nursing floor, if I gave up something concrete for something uncertain. But then I think about the retirement party at Caruso's, and a woman standing alone at the end of the bar, with a glass of water and news she didn't know what to do with, and a car ride through the rain on a Thursday night in October, and I think about how sometimes the turning points in your life don't announce themselves. They just show up quiet in the middle of an ordinary evening and ask you to pay attention. I think about the thing Dr. Frances Keller said to me before she got out of my car, that she wanted to stay, that she had been watching, that the pressure wasn't doubt, it was preparation. And I think about what I've come to believe, which is this: the people who are hardest to reach are sometimes the ones who most need someone to try. And the moments that change your life are almost never the big, dramatic ones. They're the small ones. The ones where you could have looked away, and you didn't.